Let's begin with the prayer. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Let's begin with this discussion where we ended up last time. So here in this lecture, we will consider a central question. And the central question is, can the philosophical tradition of East and West truly meet? And despite the vast differences in culture, despite the vast differences in language, geography, and historical development, um, we find that civilizations across the world engaged in deep systematic reflection on reality, knowledge, ethics, and the human condition needs to be compared. And these traditions may appear isolated from one another, but they share remarkably similar methods of analysis, even as they persist in unique cultural forms. As we move through this lecture that we started, you will see how Greece, India, and China each develop philosophical systems in response to major cultural crises. These crises prompted thinkers to challenge tradition, rethink fundamental assumptions, and construct new intellectual frameworks. Through this examination, we will discover not only the uniqueness of each tradition, but also the universal human impulse to seek meaning through critical reflection. Which leads us to the question, what assumptions do you personally bring when comparing Eastern and Western philosophy? What assumptions do you presume when doing so? And this is something we need to pay attention to, the assumptions. What are these assumptions and how are these assumptions important to us? Or how are these assumptions significant to us? So, the two meanings of philosophy. The word philosophy, as we said, carries two important meanings. One, the everyday sense, which refers to a person's worldview, their beliefs about life, what matters, how the world works. And everyone possesses this kind of philosophy instinctively, whether or not they study formal philosophical texts. It shapes our values, our interpretation of events, and the way we navigate daily life. That, in a sense, is an understanding of philosophy that has something to do with Weltanschauung or worldview. In contrast, we said there's the technical sense of philosophy, and this technical sense refers to a disciplined activity involving critical thinking, analytical reasoning, and rigorous argumentation. This requires clarity, logical structure, and often written traditions. Not every society develop this kind of philosophy, nor is every member of a society a philosopher in that sense. This distinction helps us better understand cross-cultural comparisons. All cultures have worldviews, and we know that, but not all cultures develop a systematic philosophical methodologies. And that's also something we need to pay attention to. Ibig sabihin, lahat may filosofiya, pero worldview lang yung filosofiyang yon. Pero hindi lahat philosopher, no? Yung philosopher na disciplined in the disciplined sense. So do you think one needs formal training to do philosophy? Or is someone who simply do thoughtful reflection enough to be called a philosopher? This is where we understand how philosophy is a critical reflection. Philosophy begins precisely when people start to question their beliefs, the beliefs that are handed down by tradition, instead of accepting, therefore, cultural stories, myths, assumptions, simply because that's how things have always been. Yun yung nakagawian. Philosophers ask whether those ideas can survive rational scrutiny. And this shift is revolutionary. It signals a move from uncritical acceptance to deliberate examination. At its core, philosophy distinguishes what people believe from what can be justified. It looks beneath the surface, no? Mas madaling tanggapin kung ano yung pinaniniwalaan na, pero ano ba yung kaya mong patunayan? What can you argue for? Um, what are the reasons behind these or that justification? And this turns towards reflective questioning. And this reflective questioning, reflexivity even, appears in ancient Greece, India, and China, each time as a response to social, political, or even intellectual upheaval. So we ask ourselves, can challenging tradition be dangerous? Can I basically ask why we do this, why we do that? Or is it disruptive? No? Nakakasira, nakakagulo. Why might society, therefore, encourage this questioning or even discourage it? Here we see why it's important for us to define philosophy, especially in a class that does comparative philosophies. Philosophy possesses several defining characteristics that distinguish it from poetry, religion, or even mythology. One, it is reflective, meaning it examines underlying assumptions rather than taking them for granted. Second, it is normative, which means it explores not just what people believe, but what they should believe about truth, goodness, and even reality. Third, it is critical, insisting that long held beliefs, handed down beliefs, be supported by clear evidence and even reasoning. Furthermore, philosophy is rational, privileging, prioritizing logical coherence over mere custom or authority. And finally, it is systematic. Philosophers aim to create coherent explanations that connect various ideas into a unified framework. These features make philosophy recognizable across cultures, even when specific beliefs differ. So let's look at those again. Reflexivity, normativity, criticality, rationality, systematicity are actually five very important components of what philosophy is. So this separates philosophy clearly from religion. Di ba? Religion is not critical or is not normative. Uh, the same is true for myth, and therefore something to pay attention to. So, one of philosophy's greatest strengths throughout the years is its cumulative nature. But here we need to pay attention. Cumulative does not imply that there's no traditions involved. There are a lot of traditions involved, no? And we need to pay attention at all of those traditions involved, no? May tradition, huwag niyong kakalimutan yon. There are traditions involved, and we need to pay attention at these traditions that are involved, no? But it's cumulative. Once a culture begins recording philosophical arguments, future thinkers can respond to, build on, or revise the ideas that came before them. Yun yung galing, di ba? This continuity allows philosophical traditions to become richer and even more complex across centuries. Without writing, much of this intellectual progress would be lost to us. But philosophers do not start from scratch. We do not have a direct Bluetooth to God, for example. Or we do not simply sit down and think from nothing as if we can develop ideas ex nihilo. No, we enter into a conversation that's already in progress. We enter into a conversation that is already ongoing. And we try to dialogue. We inherit, therefore, concepts, distinctions, problems, and analytical tools. So even when a thinker presents a radically new idea, that idea takes shapes in response to earlier positions. This is why literate civilizations like Greece, China, or even India develop long-lasting traditions of philosophical debate. So you can never approach a philosopher as if you can approach a philosopher objectively without taking into consideration who these philosophers is talking with, conversing with. Di ba? Uh, and that's the error of so many students of philosophy. They think they can simply talk about Boethius without really trying to dialogue with Boethius or with all those who conversed with Boethius. So when we study philosophers, therefore, we do not only study context, we study people who converse with these philosophers, but also go back to the original philosophers. So, philosophy cannot evolve if each generation will start from nothing. Philosophy is always a discourse. That's the reason why, even if you're working on Plato, you need to see how Plato was handed down to you on the plate. Diba? You need to pay attention who did this person read, where is this investigation coming from, why is this tradition like this or like that. Ganon. We never receive a text from nothing. We never receive a text from nothing. Three great philosophical traditions. Around the same historical moment, around 500 before the Common Era, three major centers of philosophical inquiry emerged independently from each other: China, India, and Greece. Each region developed sophisticated systems of thought involving logic, metaphysics, ethics, and social philosophy. What is remarkable is that these traditions arose without significant contact among one another. The similar timing suggests that philosophy often arises when societies undergo radical transformation or crises. Despite distinct problems and cultural settings, the methods of reasoning, analytical analytical questioning, systematic argument, and critical critique converge across three civilizations. And this convergence forms the foundation for meaningful cross-cultural dialogue. No? Uh, sabay-sabay silang umusbong. Sabay na sabay produkto ng pagbabago sa pamayanan nila, pagbabago o krises sa kanilang mga pamayanan, hiwalay na tumubo, pero sabay-sabay na tumubo. Uh, kung kaya't interesante, bakit kailangan natin sila bigyan ng pansin, di ba? Interesante, bakit mahalaga yung mga bagay-bagay na yon. Kasi iba-ibang konteksto, iba-ibang pamayanan, pero sabay-sabay tumubo, di ba? Sabay-sabay tumubo. So, the challenge of translation. When we use the term philosophy, to describe Chinese, Indian, or other traditions. Tanda nyo, philosophia, di ba? We must remember that the word itself is Greek. Other cultures develop their own terms. No? Talaga namang may kanya-kanya. Like India calls it darshana, insight, or view, darshana. China use it chesue. And Japan, tetsugaku. These terms, tetsugaku, chesue, tarshana, these terms carry different nuances and even conceptual histories. The same is true for philosophia. But because of this one, because of their differences, we need to understand that applying Western categories, philosophia, and its concept to non-Western traditions, Darshana, Chesre, Tetsugaku, can distort their meaning. Laging may Ganun naman yung pagsasalin, di ba? Pagsasalin, transfer, di ba? Pag nagsasalin ka, may lumilipat, may nalalaglag, di ba? Parang esperance lang yan, di ba? Parang esperance lang yan. May sasama, may maiiwan. Uh, kaya dapat pansinin pag gumamit ng terminolohiya, lalo pag hiniram yung terminolohiya o hindi original sa akda, sa may akda yung terminolohiya. Cross-cultural study requires sensitivity to these differences, to these nuances even. So we do not impose foreign frameworks just like that, especially on indigenous systems of thought. So we even ask ourselves, can we really understand another culture's philosophy without understanding its language? But if we emphasize the non-universality, non-comparability of these philosophies, are we even still doing philosophy or sociology or worldview? Yun yung kailangan nating pagmunihan, di ba? Uh, especially that we are always confronted with the problem of interpreting the world based on our perspective. Asking whether another culture has philosophy or other culture, may filosofiya ba yan? Ganon. Yung tanong na yan. Can unintentionally carry judgment. If we define philosophy only in Western terms, we risk dismissing or undervaluing traditions that approach inquiry knowing differently. Ethnocentrism, it's a very anthropological term, huh? Occurs when we interpret another culture solely through the lens of our own assumptions, our own worldview. Porket Kapampangan kayo, Kapampangan na lang ang basa sa lahat ng bagay. O porke Ilocano ako, Ilocano na lang ang basa sa lahat ng bagay. O dahil nasa Maynila ako, Manila-centric na lang ang basa sa lahat ng bagay. Hindi pwede. However, this does not mean ethnocentrism or the threat of ethnocentrism does not mean that comparison is impossible. It only means comparison must be done with humility and self-awareness. Instead of assuming our own categories as universal, we must allow each culture's intellectual tradition to speak on its own terms. Over time, misunderstandings can be corrected as we develop deeper familiarity. So, yes, we need to pay attention at the threat of ethnocentrism. But also, yes, we need to ask ourselves, is it possible to compare cultures without imposing bias? No? So we need to ask ourselves then, we need to ask ourselves, how do we compare equals with equals? How is it possible even to deal equals with equals, right? So a fair comparison, it's on the next slide, requires matching similar types of texts and ideas. It's really matching what is the equivalence of this with this. We cannot compare Western philosophy to Eastern religion if we exclude Western religious philosophy from the comparison. Likewise, we should not compare Greek philosophy with Indian mythology unless we also compare Greek mythological texts such as Hesiod's Theogony or the Iliad and Odyssey. This principle, compare equals with equals, especially in comparative philosophy, ensures that we evaluate intellectual traditions fairly. When this principle is ignored, false differences appear. But when it is respected, surprising similarities just emerge, revealing that multiple civilizations developed rich analytical bodies of thought. So for example, I'm doing Chinese medicine, but I compare Chinese philosophy only with Western standards. Obviously, it will fail. May baygon pa ako dun. Alisin ko tsaka yung baygon. Sa background ko. I'm home, no? I'm home. So, yes. At least maganda yung nakikita yung view. Mamaya na ako because this is recorded. O, bakit tatlo na lang kayo? Nasaan kulang kayo? So, pay attention. So, let's go back, no? When philosophy emerges, crisis in culture. Philosophy, as we said, rarely arises during periods of stability. Instead, it emerges during cultural crises, times when established beliefs, rituals, and institutions no longer seem adequate. No? May pagkukulang, cultural crisis. Philosopher Kwame Gyekye establishes that uncertainty, confusion, and social instability create the urgency for deeper reflection. People seek new foundations, especially when old ones fail. Especially when old ones fail. This pattern appears consistently across civilizations. In China, the collapse of the Zhou order pushed scholars to rethink society. In India, urbanization and the decline of Brahmanical authority, mga Brahmans, prompted new spiritual and philosophical movements. In Greece, political change and rising skepticism led thinkers to question traditional mythology, and even ethics. Crisis, therefore, is not merely destructive. Crisis in, is intellectually generative, which basically means uh, if something happens, we find ourselves in periods where we start reflecting about what happens. Uh, and that's something to pay attention to. Ano yung nangyayari? Di ba? So, let's look at China's philosophical origins, for example. Chinese philosophy emerged during one of the most chaotic times in Chinese history, the Warring States period, approximately about 700 to 200 BCE. The collapse of the Zhou feudal system, Zhou, brought in political fragmentation, warfare, and social upheaval. Rituals that once held society together were losing their power, and moral order seemed to be unraveling. Scholars then who had served in the courtly or ritual roles found themselves unemployed, prompting them to become independent thinkers and even teachers. From these chaos, the Warring States period, sprang a remarkable diversity of philosophical schools: Confucianism, Taoism, Mohism, legalism, and various others. Each school attempted to diagnose China's problems and propose a path toward restoring harmony and stability. Their differences reflect competing visions for how society should function, whether through moral cultivation, natural spontaneity, universal love, strict law, or a mixture of these concepts. Chinese philosophy, therefore, is born from a deep desire to rebuild a fractured social world. So we can, of course, think of the times of instability and ask ourselves, why do these times really encourage thinkers to radically reimagine society? Let's look at India's philosophical awakening. India's philosophical tradition emerged during a period of major transformation in its social structure, in a political social structure. As cities expanded, commerce grew, and a new merchant class developed. The authority of traditional Brahmanical rituals began to weaken. People no longer felt bound to hereditary ritual specialists for spiritual meaning. And these opened the door to new forms of inquiry focused on personal experience, meditation, and even inner liberation. It is in this context, then, that Buddhism, Jainism, and new schools with Hindu thought took shape. These traditions challenged ritualism and emphasized individual insight over social hierarchy. They asked profound questions about the self, suffering, liberation, and the nature of reality. The diversity of perspectives from materialists to ascetics reveals a vibrant intellectual climate responding to cultural shifts. So, social mobility, urbanization, can actually change people's spiritual or even philosophical interests. Something that we have to pay attention to as we live in a globalized village. Greece's turn to philosophy. In Greece, philosophy emerged during a transition from aristocratic rule to more democratic forms of governance. As political power shifted, traditional elites lost influence, and new debates emerged about justice, virtue, and the ideal political system. The rise of the sophists, wandering educators who taught rhetoric and practical reasoning, challenged long held assumptions and introduced skepticisms about truth and morality. Plato and Aristotle developed philosophy in response to these changes. Plato sought stable foundations for ethics and knowledge that would endure beyond shifting political trends. Aristotle continued this project but introduced his own empirical and systematic approach. Greek philosophy thus developed as a defense against relativism and as an attempt to articulate rational principles for personal or even political life. So democracy in this point, no, strengthened philosophical thinking. But also democracy created the confusion that philosophers try to resolve. But we need to pay attention that even before all of these things happen, before full-fledged philosophy emerged, each civilization had foundational texts that were partly mythological yet showed early signs of clear rational inquiry. In India, for example, the Vedas and the early Upanishads blended poetic imagery with speculation about the origin of existence and the nature of reality. In China, the I Ching and historical annals suggested patterns of moral and cosmic order. In Greece, Hesiod's Theogony attempted to systematize the origins of the gods and the cosmos into a coherent narrative. These precursors played a crucial transitional role, and they created the intellectual space where systematic questioning could arise. Although still grounded in myth or ritual, these texts contain the seed of later analytical thought, showing how culture slowly shift from storytelling to reflection and from tradition to inquiry. So we need to ask ourselves, can mythology be considered an early form of philosophy? Or must philosophy break completely from myth? This is something we need to pay attention to. Sorry. Uh, I am muted all along. So let's go back to the Rig Veda. Uh, so, as I was saying, the Rig Veda contains passages that move beyond storytelling and enter the realm of wonder and speculation. A famous hymn reflects on the origin of existence, contemplating whether being or not being came first, and even admitting that the ultimate truth may be unknowable. These humility and intellectual curiosity represent a powerful moment of transition, the beginning of reason questioning myth. Although the text uses poetic and religious language, it raises philosophical questions that later Indian thinkers would explore in more systematic ways. Yes, the Rig Veda, the shift from accepting creation stories to interrogating the very possibility of knowledge, marks the critical turning point of this development. The same is visible in the early logical refinement of the Upanishads. The Upanishads represent a significant step toward forward in logical analysis. For example, the Chandogya Upanishad critiques the idea that the universe began with not being, arguing instead that being must precede anything that exists. Here we see early attempts to resolve contradictions and construct coherent explanations based on reasoning rather than myth alone. So, this movement towards logical clarity obviously demonstrates how religious ideas can evolve into more philosophical formulations. Indian thinkers began to ask what exists, how it exists, and whether the world arises from unity or duality. These are questions that continue to shape metaphysical debates across cultures even today. It is here where we see the individual voice. A defining feature of philosophy is the rise of individual thinker. It's the rise of the individual thinker. Whereas myth and ritual reflect collective tradition, philosophy emerges when named individuals claim to have discovered insights through their own reasoning. Figures like Parmenides in Greece, Mengqi in China, and Shankara in India speak in the first person voice, offering arguments, critiques, and theories that stand on their own authority. This shift signifies intellectual courage because it assumes that a single mind, through its own reflective effort, can uncover truths not found in inherited tradition. It opens the door to debate, disagreement, and the unique contributions of individual geniuses who shape their entire traditions. So we need to ask ourselves, what happened? Why is individual authorship such an important step in the development of philosophy? Here we see the proliferation also of competing schools. Once individual thinkers begin to propose different ideas, philosophical traditions inevitably diversify. Schools form around different answers to shared questions. Thinkers critique one another, students refine the teachings of their masters, and rival arguments sharpen intellectual clarity. This proliferation is essential. Is essential. Uh, why? Because it prevents stagnation and it encourages dynamism and even evolving inquiry. Over time, successful ideas attract followers and then become formal schools, while others fade. Yet, even the losing schools contribute to the richness of the debate. It doesn't happen indirectly, no? The presence of competing viewpoints pushes each tradition to refine its reasoning, develop more precise terminology, and even build more comprehensive systems. And because of that, competition in a way tried to improve the quality of philosophical ideas. Although also it in a way led it to further fragmentation. Uh, Here we see, for example, Mengchi or Mencius, di ba? The student of Confucius. Well, they never met each other because Mencius would live so much later than Confucius, in fact. But something to pay attention to, okay? Um, Mengchi sought a middle path, no? And so Mencius lived during a time of intense philosophical competition in China. He confronted actually two very extreme positions. And what are the two very extreme positions that he confronted? Yang Chu's radical egoism, which advocated absolute self-preservation, and Moses's doctrine of universal love, which demanded equal concern for all people regardless of their relationships. Menchi rejected both extremes and argued for a balanced view based on natural human goodness. Menchi claimed that humans possesses innate moral tendencies, innate compassion, innate fairness, innate respect, which develop differently based on their closeness or relationship. This middle path illustrates a classic philosophical method. Identify two flawed extremes, critique both, and propose a more nuanced alternative. Menchie's work continues to influence Chinese and global moral philosophy until now. That's how important it is. So, we see the same, no? So, do you think humans are naturally good, naturally selfish, or are we in between? That's a question that we can develop from Mencius' work. Um, India's diverse philosophical landscape. Again, no, please take note that the understanding that there's a singular perspective, defining perspective, magisterial perspective is true of Catholic teaching alone, no? Which is not true of most of the most of the philosophical systems that we will study. So ancient India's philosophical diversity is often underestimated. The Digha Nikaya recount Kings Ajatasatru's encounters with six different teachers whose doctrines range from strict determinism to radical materialism. Some denied moral causation entirely, others emphasized fate or the eternity of atoms. Still others, like Jainism, offered rigorous ethical and metaphysical systems centered on liberation from suffering. This variety reveals an intellectual environment far richer and more pluralistic than stereotypes suggest. Just as Greece had skeptics, materialists, idealists, and rationalists, India had multiple competing worldviews, each challenging the others through debate and even argument. This diversity laid the groundwork for the highly sophisticated philosophical traditions of classical India. And this is also something we need to pay attention to. Those important movements of sorts. Okay? Those important movements of sorts, which will play a very important role to our moving forward, right? To our moving forward. And that's something that we need to constantly reflect on, di ba? We need to constantly pay attention to. Because here we also see something more, di ba? But we need to ask ourselves, what happened? Why did they diversify this early? This early. Now, talking of diversification, talking about the development of all of these different systems, we need to also try to understand what philosophy as a discipline requires. And philosophy requires evidence and argument. Philosophers cannot rely on tradition alone. They must justify their claims with definitions, arguments, and even logical distinctions. Indian Buddhism, for example, uh, and Jainism challenge Orthodox Hinduism so forcefully that Hindu thinkers were compelled to refine their doctrines using reason rather than relying solely on sacred authority. This adversarial process, where every claim requires supporting arguments, pushes traditions forward and toward greater clarity and coherence. Here, philosophy by nature invites critiques and thrives on debate. Writing and philosophical tradition. Writing is essential for philosophical development. No, most of the philosophy that we have right now were written at some point. Even if, for example, Buddha never wrote, Confucius never wrote, or even Jesus or Socrates never wrote. Oral cultures can preserve stories and rituals, but the complexity of philosophical reasoning, technical terminology, long arguments, multiple positions requires written records. Without writing, philosophical traditions would constantly restart rather than build upon past insights. Libraries and manuscripts allowed thinkers in India, Greece, and China to engage with ideas of predecessors across centuries. And this continuity made it possible for philosophical schools to grow richer and more sophisticated over time. So, philosophy will change radically in a world without writing. So, writing and philosophy are actually technically two intertwined worlds, no? Two intertwined worlds. Philosophy then, we need to see, emerged alongside the democratization of learning. Or in earlier societies, knowledge was restricted to elite hereditary classes, often kept secret within ritual roles. But the scholars became independent teachers, sophists in Greece, wandering scholars in China. Knowledge became available to anyone willing to learn. Public institutions like Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and Confucian schools transformed private wisdom into public discourse. And this shift allowed philosophy to develop as a shared intellectual enterprise rather than a guarded tradition alone. This will be pushed forward by the development of universities. Philosophical traditions endured only when supported by institutions. Plato's Academy lasted 800 years. Confucian civil service examination shaped Chinese intellectual life for 2 millennia. In India, six Orthodox Hindu schools preserved and refined their systems for centuries. Institutions provide stability, continuity, and legitimacy. They allow ideas to be preserved, taught, and critiqued, and even reimagined across generations, ensuring that philosophical traditions do not vanish with their founders. So, institutions play an important role in maintaining the intellectual traditions. Do not forget that. But philosophy, we need to see, is still not doctrine, but practice. Still not doctrine, but practice. Okay? Philosophy, and we're still trying to engage what we understand philosophy to be. No? Philosophy isn't defined by its conclusions, but by its methods. By its methods. Two philosophers may disagree completely, yet both are practicing philosophy if they engage in critical, rational, systematic reflection, which stands in contrast to religion, which often focuses on specific doctrines or even beliefs. Understanding philosophy as a practice helps us appreciate even why widely different systems, Buddhism, Confucianism, Aristotelianism, Vedanta, are all philosophical. And what unites these is not their answers, but the way they pursue understanding. So we're still trying to distinguish philosophy from all the other religion, for example. In this case, religion focuses on personal faith, communal rituals, divine revelation, whereas philosophy, when applied to religion, becomes religious philosophy, an attempt to analyze, clarify, and justify religious beliefs using reason. Philosophical theology, therefore, is not faith itself. It is faith examined through critical inquiry. Every major religious tradition has philosophical interpretations. Christian theology, Hindu Vedanta, Buddhist Abhidharma, Islamic Kalam. These interpretations attempt to reconcile religious teachings with logic and even coherence. So, but can there be religious philosophical problems in religious contexts? For sure. Religious thinkers encounter philosophical problems that demand rational analyses. So, how can a good and all powerful God allow evil, for example? How do body and soul interact if they are fundamentally different substances? If Buddhism denies a permanent self, what is reborn? Or how can human language describe a transcendent God? These challenges reveal why religious traditions inevitably produce philosophical thinkers. Faith alone cannot resolve logical contradictions without systematic thought. In that case, then you understand why philosophy can defend and at the same time attack religion. Philosophy serves multiple functions within religion. It clarifies doctrines, defends beliefs from critics, refutes rival traditions, and resolves internal contradictions. Augustine used philosophy to defend Christianity from Manichaean dualism. Hindu thinkers debated Buddhists for centuries. Buddhist philosophers critiqued Hindu metaphysics with rigorous logic. But philosophy can also challenge religious assumptions, pushing traditions to evolve. It also can expose inconsistencies, demand clarity, and dismantle poorly reasoned beliefs. Thus, philosophy both supports and critiques religion. But philosophy has its own limits in religion. Many religious traditions acknowledge the limits of philosophy. Tertullian famously said, "I believe because it is absurd," emphasizing faith over reason. Buddha warned that intellectual speculation cannot replace spiritual practice. Kierkegaard argued that true faith requires a leap beyond rational justification. Even Thomas Aquinas, one of the history's greatest religious philosophers, abandoned philosophy late in life after a mystical experience, calling his writing straw. These moments remind us that while philosophy can support religion, it cannot fully replace the experiential dimension of faith. And this is where we see the distinction between Christian, Hindu, and even Buddhist philosophy. Christianity seeks to integrate Greek philosophical ideas through thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. Hinduism includes multiple philosophical interpretations. Advaita, Vish, Vishittadvaita, Dvaita, each offering a different understanding of divine reality. Buddhism, too, contains sophisticated philosophical systems such as Madhyamaka and Yogacara, which analyze emptiness, consciousness, and enlightenment with remarkable precision. Islam also engaged deeply with Greek philosophy through their scholars like Al-Farabi and Ibicena or Avicenna. Although some later thinkers resisted a lot of philosophical influence. Across cultures then, philosophy and religion interact in complex ways, sometimes embracing each other, sometimes resisting, but always reforming. Always reforming. And that's something we need to pay attention to. A while ago, we started by trying to create a distinction between Weltanschauung worldview and philosophy. Yes, worldviews differ, but analysis converges. While Greece, India, and China develop different worldviews and religious assumption, uh, we need to also recognize where philosophy enters, right? Their methods, these worldviews methods of analysis often converge. For example, Hinduism explored karma and liberation. Greece examined freedom and reason. China emphasized harmony and social roles. Yet, each tradition used logical argument, conceptual distinction, and systematic reasoning to analyze its own worldview. This suggests that while cultures may disagree about fundamental beliefs, The tools used to examine those beliefs, logic, critique, rational inquiry, are largely universal. Analytical thinking appears to be a shared human capacity that transcends cultural boundaries, and therefore something we need to pay attention to. Yes, different problems, but the method seems similar. Culture pursue knowledge for different reasons. Controlling nature, achieving liberation, evaluating debate methods, or understanding tradition. Despite these differences, once knowledge becomes a philosophical problem, cultures converge on how they analyze it. And that's where these things differ. No? That's where these things are different. Okay? Uh, this suggests, therefore, that analytical thinking operates on something strikingly similar. Like the case of a like the case of mind and consciousness. Each tradition approach the mind and consciousness differently. Western philosophers ask how the immaterial mind interacts with the body and whether free will exists. Indian tradition explored whether consciousness can exist without sensory objects and what, if anything, survives rebirth. Chinese thinkers examined the unity of thought and emotion through the concept of Shin, heart-mind. Despite these differences in focus, all three traditions developed sophisticated theories of mental states, awareness, and cognition. Their differences reflect cultural concerns, but the shared depth of analysis shows universal interest in understanding the mind. An example in case is consciousness as it's understood in India. Traditional Hindu texts associate ultimate reality, Brahman or Atman, with a pure form of consciousness, one that exists without change, desire, or even sensory input. This raises deep questions. What does consciousness without context look like? How can awareness exist without an object? Indian philosophers explored states such as waking, dreaming, deep sleep, considered all of this one. Uh, and analyzed here different layers of consciousness, no? Different layers of consciousness, which we have to pay attention to. Okay? Uh, these analyses, while rooted in Indian religious concerns, offer insights that resonate with modern philosophical and psychological debates about consciousness. Let's look at language philosophy. Indian philosopher Indian philosophers um, paid attention, uh, explored language because they believe Vedic scriptures were eternal and thereby existing even prior to God or to the gods. These raised profound questions. What is language? How can meaning exist independently of speakers? Or does language reflect reality or merely convention? Greek philosophers focused on language because of its role in democratic debates and truth seeking, while Chinese thinkers studied language to understand correct naming while maintaining social order. No, so totally different, no, totally different perspectives. Despite differences in motivation, all three traditions examined meaning, reference, prediction, and linguistic conventions. Interesting, in fact. Universal problems, cultural solutions. Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gyekye argued that humans everywhere grapple with certain universal problems, ethical dilemmas, questions of knowledge, questions of meaning. While cultures differ in how they approach these problems, the underlying human concerns are shared. Thus, philosophical inquiry, in this sense, is both universal and particular. It is universal in its methods and concerns, but particular in the cultural frameworks that shape its solutions. This balance helps us appreciate both diversity and commonality across global traditions. But we still need to reach the point where we distinguish culture from philosophy. A culture's philosophical sophistication does not imply that its broader society shares the same values. For example, although Aristotle offered advanced philosophical arguments, Greek society still practiced slavery and denied many modern rights. Similarly, philosophical ideas from China and India do not necessarily reflect everyday cultural attitudes. We need to understand that philosophy represents a specialized form of intellectual reflection, not the totality of culture. Recognizing this distinction prevents us from mistakenly equating a philosopher's view with a society's norms. So here we have to see, oh, why are you even studying Greek or Indian philosophy? Eh, Kapampangan naman kayo, Pilipino naman kayo, nasa Pilipinas naman kayo. There's still something universal in philosophy. Not all cultural elements have equal universality. We need to pay attention at that. Logic and mathematics are highly philosophical or universal. Art and ethical principles, art and ethical principles are different. They have moderate universality. Religious practices and social customs tend to be more culture specific. Marriage customs and cuisine are highly specific. Philosophy, in contrast to all these, occupies a middle high level of universality. Its methods are highly transferable, but its problems and frameworks often reflect local concerns. This explains why philosophical ideas travel more easily across cultures than rituals or even political norms. That's why philosophy always challenge communal individual stereotypes. A common stereotype says Asian cultures are communal while Western cultures are individualistic. This oversimplification ignores internal diversity, historical change, and the fact that these patterns often reflect stages of societal development rather than inherent cultural traits. In practice, both religions contain individualistic and communal philosophies. Taoism, for example, champions individual spontaneity, while Western thinkers like Rousseau or Marx emphasize community. Thus, cultural stereotypes often obscure more than they reveal. So we need to pay attention. What are our stereotypes? And what happens when we provide our stereotypes? Stereotypes are like biases of sorts, right? Internal diversity within traditions. Asian traditions are not uniformly communal. Confucianism emphasizes social harmony, but Taoism promotes radical individualism. And Buddhism encourages personal liberation. Even within Confucianism, thinkers like Zhuangzi or Kung Fu or Zhuangzi believe humans are naturally selfish. Similarly, Western traditions are not uniformly individualistic. Medieval Christianity, communitarian philosophers, social contract theorists highlight collective values. Culture, therefore, contain multiple voices and simplistic labels fail to capture this richness. In reality, communalism is even beyond Asia. Communal values are not uniquely Asian. African philosophy emphasizes community as the foundation of personhood. Indigenous cultures worldwide prioritize kingship, land, and group identity over individual achievement. This broader view reveals that communalism is a human pattern associated with certain stages of social organization, not an Asian essence. But living in the contemporary time complicates the picture. modernization, or even contemporary, postmodern, post-truth scenarios tend to produce more individualistic lifestyle across cultures. Japan, China, and Singapore have shifted toward nuclear families and independent living. African nations show similar trends as urbanization increases. These changes indicate that the communal individual distinction that we often use to distinguish East from West is shaped more by economic development rather than by cultural essence. Uh, cultures evolve, values shift with new social realities. Here we distinguish ideals versus practices. Many societies claim communal ideals even when their actual behavior becomes increasingly individualistic. For example, Asian cultures often praise family loyalty and collective values even as younger generations pursue personal careers or move away from homes. This gap between ideals and practices complicates cultural labels. What people say they value may reflect nostalgia for past norms rather than current behavior. So we're not concerned with ideals. We also need to check practices. Or is there such a thing as essence, or we look at development? Communalism, for example, and individualism appear to reflect stages of social development. Traditional societies tend to be communal, industrialized societies tend to be individualistic. This pattern occurs across cultures like Africa, Asia, and European alike. Thus, labeling an entire civilization as individualistic or communal ignores the deeper dynamics of economic, geographic, and social change. Development, not essence, therefore plays a very important role because it is this that shapes these patterns. So here we need to see what's the political, so something very interesting is the argument that because we're Asian, we're communitarian and things like that. The concept of Asian values is sometimes used politically to justify authoritarianism, restrict human rights, or frame dissent as un-Asian. Leaders may claim cultural uniqueness to avoid democratic pressures or criticism, and corporations and governments may invoke different cultural values. So to ensure to excuse exploitative practices or mass governance failures, thus we must distinguish sincere cultural claims from political rhetoric that actually weaponize culture. No? So we need to pay attention at this weaponization. No? So we're still looking at stereotypes and how these stereotypes are moving forward. And we shall resume our discussion after a short break. So the narrative of Asian values, as we are saying, can be deployed for political ends. Governments may use this to justify restricting human rights or suppressing dissent and arguing that Western style freedoms do not fit Asian cultures. And this shows how cultural ideas can be manipulated to serve political agendas. And therefore, the same stereotype that flatters cultural pride can also limit social freedoms. Philosophical critique thereby helps expose these rhetorical uses of cultures. So, but there are also Western stereotypes. So, let's pay attention at these stereotypes and what they do. Okay? So some Westerners idealize the East as spiritual, peaceful, and harmonious, an imagined opposite to their own society, which they view as materialistic or aggressive. This is a form of Orientalism described by Edward Said, in which the East becomes a projection of Western anxieties rather than a real place with its own complexities. This romanticization can seem flattering, but is ultimately dehumanizing. It reduces the rich civilizations to simplistic caricatures and prevents genuine understanding. True cross-cultural appreciation requires seeing the East as it is, not as a mirror for Western desires. But there are also Eastern stereotypes of ourselves, right? Interestingly, some Asians like us think and adopt these same stereotypes, presenting ourselves as morally superior, more spiritual, more harmonious. This can arise from post-colonial efforts to reclaim pride after centuries of domination, but it can also perpetuate unrealistic self-images. When both Westerners and Easterners reinforce the same stereotypes, mutual misconceptions grow, and cross-cultural philosophy seeks to break these patterns and encourage more nuanced self-understanding. Whether we like it or not, rejecting these stereotypes will play an important role. Rejecting the stereotypes does not mean denying real cultural differences. China, India, and Greece have distinct religious frameworks, historical trajectories, social institutions, and these differences influence their philosophical questions and emphases. The key insight is that philosophical methods differ less than cultural worldviews. Traditions may disagree deeply about the nature of reality, but they often analyze their disagreements using similar tools. And this distinction allows us to compare philosophies without erasing genuine cultural diversity. So, in reality, philosophical traditions tend to follow cycles. In periods of innovation, bold thinkers challenge conventions and propose new ideas. Eventually, these ideas are consolidated, systematized, and taught to new generations. Later, traditions become dogmatic, resisting change and discouraging creativity. Eventually, a renewal occurs when crises or new insights break through the stale orthodoxy. This cycle is visible across Greek, Chinese, and even Indian philosophies, showing the intellectual stagnation uh, and of renewal are not culture specific, but inherent in philosophical development. But also, you need to understand late, later philosophy sometimes has the tendency to become conservative. As philosophical systems mature, they often become rigid. Medieval European scholasticism, later Chinese Confucianism, and classical Indian Vedanta all drifted toward orthodoxy. And once radical thinkers like Confucius and Aristotle were treated as unquestionable authorities, philosophy at this point loses its critical spirit. When tradition outweighs inquiry, renewing philosophy then requires challenging the very authorities earlier generations revered, a pattern repeated in every intellectual civilization. In this case, borrowed philosophy arrives conservative. When cultures adopt foreign philosophers, they usually receive them in already finished form. Romans inherited Greek philosophy as a closed canon. Japan absorbed Chinese Confucianism as established doctrine. Medieval Islam and Christianity received Aristotle as the ultimate authority. This means borrowed philosophy often appears rigid compared to its original dynamic development. Only later do new cultures reinterpret and revitalize the ideas, making them their own. That's why we also need to reevaluate philosophical peaks. Traditions often mistakenly view their most orthodox periods as intellectual peaks. For centuries, Neo-Confucianism was considered the height of Chinese philosophy. But modern scholars see earlier eras as far more vibrant. Similarly, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta was long considered India's pinnacle, but earlier pluralistic debates were arguably more diverse and dynamic. Historical periods of diversity, debate, and experimentation tend to be more philosophically fertile than later orthodoxies which suppress dissent. And that's something we have to pay attention to. In fact, philosophy rarely replaces religion. Instead, it coexists with it, providing critical analysis and conceptual tools. With the rise of modern science, philosophy took on a third role, analyzing science's assumptions while continuing to examine religious claims. This middle position is both powerful and precarious. Philosophy critiques both science and religion, but risks of being overshadowed by them. Yet its reflective role remains essential for navigating the conceptual foundations of both domains. Here we see also what happened between philosophy and religion. Sandali lang. Nag-message, sorry. Distinguishing philosophy from religion is historically difficult because philosophy often grows out of religious texts and practices. Medieval European philosophy is deeply Christian. Indian philosophy is inseparable from Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. Christian philosophy, Chinese philosophy is entangled with Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Because these traditions emerge gradually, the boundary between religion and philosophy is very blurry. What matters is not the subject matter, but the approach. Whether ideas are accepted or authority or examined critically and systematically. Yes, we need to separate really philosophy from religion. That's important too. Religion centers on faith, ritual, community, and sacred revelation. Philosophy, even when religious, aims for logical justification, conceptual clarity, and systematic coherence. Both may address the same topics, God, the soul, ethics, but with very different purposes. The distinction is important for comparative philosophy. It allows us to analyze Buddhist logic, Christian theology, Hindu metaphysics, without reducing them to religion or ignoring their philosophical rigor. Now, cross-cultural philosophical influence. Philosophical exchange has been happening for centuries. Greek thought influenced Christian theology. Buddhism revolutionized Chinese philosophy. Western philosophy prompted Asian thinkers in the 20th century to reinterpret their own traditions. And today, Asian philosophy increasingly influences Western discourse. These exchanges demonstrate that philosophy is not confined to cultural borders. Traditions stimulate, challenge, and enrich one another across time and space. In this case, we will implement a cross-cultural model. Cross-cultural study changes both sides. Western philosophers engaging with Indian and Chinese thought often shift interest toward mystical, ethical, and wisdom-oriented figures with their own heritage. Meanwhile, Asian scholars comparing their traditions to Western philosophy have revived neglected materialists, skeptics, and logicians from their own history. Comparison, in this case, is not just academic, it reshapes traditions by highlighting what was previously ignored or undervalued. It revitalizes global philosophy by deepening self understanding. Here we see the value of comparative philosophy. Comparative philosophy broadens our perspectives by challenging our assumptions about showing us alternative ways of thinking. It helps us understand our own traditions better by revealing the hidden assumptions behind them. It also builds global understanding in an interconnected world where cultural literacy is essential. Most importantly, comparative philosophy generates new ideas by placing different systems in dialogue. These creative intersections produce insights impossible within any single tradition. So, so here we see how we move towards uh, world philosophy or moving towards world philosophy. In centuries, in centuries, each culture studied mostly its own tradition. Today's globalized world demands a broader perspective. If Greece, India, and China all develop rich, rigorous philosophies, then a complete understanding of philosophy must integrate all three. World philosophy is not about erasing cultural differences, but about engaging them constructively, creating a richer, more inclusive global conversation. And this requires patience, linguistic skills, and cultural humanity. And the reward is profound, is profound. Lastly, philosophy emerges uh, philosophy emerges from specific cultural crises, traditions, and frameworks. And that's very important in comparative philosophy. Okay? Yet it develops analytical tools that are universally recognizable. Its questions vary across cultures, but its methods, logic, critique, reflection, systematic inquiry, are shared. This balance between the universal and particular allows meaning cross-cultural understanding. By respecting cultural differences while recognizing shared human reasoning, we can engage in genuine comparative philosophy. And this helps us overcome stereotypes, deepen mutual understanding, and move toward a broader, more inclusive vision of human wisdom. May this journey across Greece, India, and China remind us that though we speak in different languages and dream in different symbols, we are all co-authors in the same great human search for truth, goodness, and the life worth living. Thank you very much for listening and see you in the next lecture.